Welcome back to She Rises Daily, Emerging You in 10. I'm your host, DocShellie, here to bring you your daily dose of inspiration, empowerment, and growth. Have you ever known you wanted to change your mind and then immediately started thinking about how ridiculous you were going to look? I already told everyone. I said this is what I wanted. I've committed to this. I was so sure. What are people going to think? All these things go through our brains. So instead of changing direction, you keep going. Not because you still believe in the decision, but because you don't want to look inconsistent. Here's the question I want us to wrestle with today. When did changing our minds become evidence that we can't trust ourselves? Because sometimes changing your mind is not evidence that the first decision was foolish. It's evidence that you've learned something since you made that decision. And if you're committed to growth, you have to be willing to let new information change your direction. Consistency is not the same thing as integrity. We tend to admire consistency, and for good reason. Consistency builds trust. It helps us follow through. It demonstrates commitment. And consistency without discernment can become rigidity. Integrity isn't, I said this 5 years ago, so I must continue believing it forever. Integrity is, I'm willing to be honest about what I know now. Sometimes integrity requires staying the course, and sometimes integrity requires admitting, I see this differently now. The goal isn't to be consistent with every opinion you've ever had. The goal is to be consistent with your values while allowing your understanding to evolve. That is a much higher standard. New information should be allowed to change the decision. Imagine making every decision in your life using only the information you had 10 years ago. Kind of ridiculous, right? You have learned since then. You have experienced things. You've probably made some mistakes. I know I have. You've succeeded. You have met people. You've developed skills. You've discovered things about yourself you couldn't possibly have known before. And yet sometimes we expect today's decisions to remain loyal to yesterday's information. Why? A thoughtful decision is not carved in stone. It's made using the best information available at the time. When meaningful new information arrives, thoughtful people reconsider. That's not indecision. That is updating. We do this everywhere else. Businesses change strategies when the market changes. Scientists revise conclusions when new evidence emerges. Leaders adjust plans when conditions shift. Growth requires that same flexibility. I've coached people who knew they wanted to change direction, but were almost embarrassed to admit it. They'd say, but I was so sure when I made that decision. And I understand why that bothers them. Because somehow we've decided that if we were truly self-aware, we'd make the correct decision the first time and we would never need to revisit it. So I'll sometimes ask, what do you know now that you didn't know when you made that decision? And that is usually where the conversation changes. Because now we're not judging the earlier decision using today's information. We're recognizing that the earlier version of them made the best choice they could with what they knew then. And now they know more. You don't have to criticize your past self for not knowing something you hadn't learned yet. You can appreciate the decision you made in the past and make a different one with the information you have today. Be aware of the sunk cost of identity. We usually talk about sunk costs in terms of money or time. I've already invested this much, so I can't stop now. And I think there's another sunk cost we don't talk about enough, and that is with our identity. I've always been the person who everyone knows me as. I've spent years building this. This is what I said I wanted. Now, we're not just protecting an investment. We're protecting our identity. And that can make changing direction incredibly difficult because we're not asking, does this still fit? We're asking, who will I be if it doesn't? That's a scarier question. You are allowed to outgrow your own description of yourself. Your identity can evolve too. Changing your mind doesn't mean you can't trust yourself. This may be the most important part here. Sometimes people worry, if I change my mind now, how will I trust my next decision? We have to recognize that self-trust isn't built by never changing your mind. It's built by knowing you will continue paying attention. You're going to continue learning. You'll continue telling yourself the truth. You'll adjust when the evidence warrants it. That is trustworthy. In fact, I'd argue that stubbornly staying committed to something you no longer believe simply because you once chose it isn't self-trust at all. It's self-abandonment. You don't have to prove yesterday's version of you was right. You need to make the wisest choice available to today's version of you. Here's your reflection question. Where in your life are you staying consistent with an old decision, belief, goal, or identity simply because changing your mind feels harder than admitting you have changed? And what do you know now that you didn't know then? And your power thought. Changing your mind isn't always evidence that you were wrong. Sometimes it's evidence that you have learned. You are going to change your mind. I hope you do. Not about everything. Not every 5 minutes. Let's not get carried away now. But if you're learning, growing, having new experiences, listening to people whose lives are different from yours, and becoming more self-aware, then some of what you believe today should evolve. Some goals will change. Some priorities will shift. Some decisions may need to be revisited. That is not a flaw in your growth. That is growth. You are not required to remain loyal to outdated information simply because you once made a confident decision with it. Learn, update, and choose again. This week, think about one decision, belief, or commitment you've been reluctant to reconsider, and ask yourself, what do I know now that I didn't know when I originally chose this? And listen to your answer. You don't automatically have to change anything, but give today's wisdom permission to participate in today's decisions. Thank you for joining me for another episode of She Rises Daily, Emerging You in 10. If today's episode made you think of someone who's beating themselves up for changing their mind, please share this episode with them. And until next time, remember, you can honor the person who made the original decision without requiring yourself to keep making it forever. You aren't betraying who you were. You're allowing what you've learned to shape who you're becoming.